capsule will be hurtled into the heavens by a mighty Atlas rocket. A failure in any one of the thousands of parts of the rocket could mean death for the red-headed test pilot who volunteered for space flight because of the challenge.
John Glenn was about to ride the Atlas, a rocket that had a nasty habit of blowing up. But we had an appointment with the moon.
3, 2, 1, 0. Good Lord, ride all the way. You got speed, John Glenn.
All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff.
The Atlas missile has lifted off from the pad and is rising steady into the sky. And John Glenn, Jr. has begun his first orbital ride around the Earth.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
They were so concerned that you not be distracted by other things that the original plan was that I would not even take a camera along. I thought this was getting to be a little ridiculous, and I said, look, I'm going up on this thing, and this is going to be a new view of things, and I think we at least ought to have a camera on this.
Friendship 7, Bermuda has you. Roger, Bermuda, stand by. This is Friendship 7.
The first orbit was beautiful. Then John started going on and on about something outside his window, and we started wondering if there was a screw loose up in the spacecraft.
This is Friendship 7. I am in a big mass of some very small particles that are brilliantly lit up like they're luminescent.
George Ruff, who was the psychiatrist that followed us around in those early days, and George sat in the back of the room, and I was describing these very seriously and talking about him, and George cocked his head and said, "And what did they say, John?"
15 minutes later, we all stopped laughing.
Go ahead, Jim.
Roger, you do have a valid impact bag signal up at this time.
A valid what?
A light in mission control said John's heat shield was loose. At 17,000 miles an hour, when he re-entered, the friction would heat the capsule to 3,000 degrees. Without that shield, he was a dead man.
This is Al Shepard. Yeah, we want to be damn sure on this one.
We've been talking about it on the ground for a long time. You didn't know anything was going on up there. And I was Capcom. And it was my job to tell you what we were, that your heat shield was loose and might fall off. You remember that one?
I remember very well, and you sort of talked around it a little bit about what is your indication of this switch, and you have this warning light, and I knew from the questions there's only one thing that could be indicated. And then finally, a decision was made to leave it on and make the re-entry with the retro pack.
Package falling through the entire re-entry. Do you read? This is Friendship 7. What is the reason for this? Do you have any reason? Over? Not at this time.
All we could do was tell him not to jettison his retro pack. There was a chance it might keep the heat shield on and keep John alive.
Go ahead, Cape. You're going out.
John was hitting the atmosphere. Now the heat began. If he was going to burn alive, it would happen in the next 5 minutes, but we wouldn't know till it was over. The same friction that might kill him also blocked all radio signals. We could only wait and hope and keep listening.
7, this is Cape. Transmitting blind. Keep talking, Al. Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Over. Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Over. Main chute is on green. Chute is out in reach condition at 10,800 feet and beautiful chute.
When we finally heard his voice, he sounded like a kid on Christmas morning.
On O2 emergency, and the chute looks very good.
If John had died, the whole program might have died with him. But he didn't, and now he was a made man. The Navy sent a chopper to pick him up, but he didn't really need it. At that point, John Glenn could have walked on water.
The man who conquered outer space makes a new conquest as he takes New York by storm.
Al's reception had been big, but this was unbelievable. John's flight moved people. It was almost scary. This PR thing had grown into something a lot bigger than any of us, or NASA, or even the politicians had bargained for.
Down at his feet. The president stays on the sidelines as Mrs. Kennedy and high-flying Glenn practically go into orbit aboard water skis.
Old John was always sharp about stuff the rest of us barely thought of. Now he set his sights on a whole new orbit. 1962, 3 years since I'd joined the program. I'd been poked and prodded by doctors, paraded around for the press and politicians. I'd mastered every simulator, passed every test. Deke Slayton's time had finally come. The next flight was mine.
Is that your capsule sitting back there?
Oh, yes, it is.
How do you feel about it being out in the elements here this afternoon?
Oh, I don't mind it being in the elements if somebody was working on it.
You're raring to go.
Yes, sir.
You're damn right I was raring to go. John Glenn had taken us into orbit, and just surviving it was so remarkable it made him a legend. Now I was going to do it again and prove that the remarkable could become routine. And if I say so myself, I was the best pilot for the job.
He just was a pilot's pilot. He just loved to fly. He'd rather fly. If he couldn't fly, he'd die.
And then the worst thing I could ever imagine happened. I was grounded.
This is a diagnosis of paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. The only decision that has been made is that Deke will not take the next mission in the MA-7.
An irregular heartbeat. I'd had it for years and nobody blinked. Now, just months before my flight, NASA got nervous. If anything went wrong, they didn't want to look bad. I was grounded.
Feeling going to go out. Damn disappointed.
They can't do this to me. I mean, he kept saying that over and over again. They can't do this to me. This isn't fair. He was very, very, very upset and very angry and very hurt because this career meant so much to him. To be an astronaut meant so much to him.
I tried everything. Quit smoking, quit coffee, started jogging my ass off. The whole deal stunk. But I figured it was temporary. I'd get the next flight. But for Wally Schirra, things were looking up. He was my backup. He thought.
I was off on a trip somewhere. I remember I flew back into Langley in one of our planes, probably a 102, and landed and came by Scott Carpenter and Reen Carpenter's quarters, and my wife was there and the rest of the gang. And as I drove up my little flashy yellow Healy, Scott came out before I even got to join the group and said, Wally, we got a problem. Deke's grounded. Immediately I thought, oh, God, it's my flight. And Scott looked at me and said, no, it's not your flight, as if he read my mind. He said, it's my flight, and you'll be my backup. Thud. Another shot in the rear end.
I was disappointed for Deke, but that is in the conventional medical wisdom of the time. That was the decision that NASA made. They gave it to me because I had been so busy with John's flight that they figured I was in better shape to do it.
So instead of Wally Schirra, precision test pilot, we ended up with someone completely different.
Scott is a unique person. He's different. Not only different from the other astronauts, but different from all the other people in the world.
NASA saw the job as pure flight test. Evaluate the spacecraft and come home, nothing more. Scotty marched to a different drummer.
I was more interested in learning about what was there than I was in learning about what got us there. The engineering test pilot flies just to evaluate his machine. That has to be done. But my drummer told me that this is a marvelous opportunity to look at the space environment.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
I feel the liftoff. The clock has started.
From the moment he lifted off, Scott wanted to report the feeling, the human experience of being in space.
much closer to the Earth than I expected to be.
Scott was like Mr. Wizard up there. He wanted to understand the unknowns of space, like John Glenn's fireflies.
It's hard to realize this now. There were so many unknowns in the early days. And this is a fact of the matter. We were really not sure after John flew whether or not there were critters, living critters out there somewhere.
I have the fireflies, almost like a light snowflake particle.
Scott figured out the fireflies were really wastewater from the capsule. Astronaut pee-pee.
Those fireflies weren't fireflies.
No, they weren't. They weren't fireflies. It was a constellation, you're right.
Well, that mystery was solved. But Scotty's experiments wasted fuel and took his mind off flying.
Some appear to glow, but I don't believe they really do.
A test pilot who gets distracted can wind up dead. In mission control, Chris Kraft was ready to blow a fuse.
He was in a mess with trying to determine what the hell the fireflies were that Glenn had seen. He wasn't in the right attitude in the spacecraft, and he had not gone through the checklist required to get ready for retrofiring.
I think I'm going to have to go to fly-by-wire and use the window and the scope.
Scott was 3 seconds late firing his retro rockets. At the speed he was going, 3 seconds late meant he'd land hundreds of miles off course. But even worse, he was out of fuel.
There was the flaming piece coming off. Almost looked like it came off the tower. Oh, I hope not.
No fuel. No way to steer. If the angle of re-entry was off, he'd burn alive.
I do remember thinking, maybe I won't make it, and this is really tight, but thinking to myself, I ought to be worried about this, but I really am not. And I thought at that time, I feel almost like I'm somewhere else looking at this situation, interested but not involved. And I thought, isn't that handy?
This is Mercury Control. We are still attempting to reestablish contact with the Aurora 7 spacecraft.
For 40 minutes, the world waited to hear if Scott was dead or alive.
Our data at this time indicates that it is distinctly possible that the Aurora 7 spacecraft may land considerably longer downrange than it was planned.
The ship started coming in, and there he is, blithely outside. I can't believe it. And perfectly under control. What's wrong? I'm here. And that was Scott.
I understand the report came from Hawaii that it was a tired and confused astronaut. If my opinion is worth anything to you, this is not true. I will admit to being preoccupied.
It was uncanny luck that he survived. And he's goddamn lucky that it didn't come down bass backwards, because it could have. Somebody was looking out for him.
I didn't realize that people thought I was lucky to make it through. I really never felt that it had been that tight. But that's the sort of thing you have to face whenever you do new things that have never been done before. There are a lot of different masters to serve. I was listening to another drummer where my interest in science was concerned in the flight.
You know, Scotty probably got more out of that one flight than all the rest of us put together. But NASA wasn't paying us to be human. They wanted astronauts to keep their feelings to themselves, do the job and make it look easy. Scott got the standard hero's welcome, but NASA made sure he never flew again.
The Russians chalk up another victory in the space race as they put 2 manned spacecraft into orbit within 24 hours of each other.
2 spacecraft up at once, within sight of each other. That might mean rendezvous, and rendezvous was a big step toward the moon.
Tracking stations indicate that there is little doubt of the success of the Russian feat that is seen as 2 years ahead of the U.S. effort.
Now the Russians were flying for days at a time. We could only manage a few hours. After nearly losing Scott Carpenter, the program had to regain credibility. On our next flight, we had to perform better and stay up longer. And Wally Schirra was the guy to do it.
I've lifted off, watch it started. As he feels real nice.
Typical Wally. He cut out every science experiment he could. He had one goal, to fly the perfect mission.
Park is riding beautiful, Dick.
And he did it, a textbook flight. But the world hardly noticed. Wally had splashed down in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought it home. Before cosmonauts and astronauts, the original payloads were nuclear warheads. Now we were eyeball to eyeball.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
Luckily for us, the Russians blinked. They took their missiles home. At least for now, life and the space race would go on.
Do you recognize this man? He's astronaut Alan Shepard, America's first man in space.
America had space fever. The Mercury 7 were the biggest celebrities around, and we knew it. NASA needed us, and we never let them forget it. We'd become much more than test pilots. We were carrying the image of the whole space program on our shoulders.
I remember thinking in the early days what a force we could be within NASA if we all presented a unified stand. And it occurred to me that we were the most powerful entity within NASA, and that NASA had a tiger by the tail in this group of 7 astronauts.
NASA was beginning to wish we were a little less famous and a lot easier to control. They decided they'd bring in a chaperone, some Army general, to make us toe the line. Well, that went over like a turd in a punch bowl. Then somebody had a bright idea.
We began to think, do we want an outsider to do this, or should we have one of us do it? And that's when the 7 of us got together and decided we better have Deke do this.
The 6 of them wanted to put me in charge of the astronaut office. The guys were kind of throwing me a bone and solving their astronaut boss problem, all in one neat package. But if the Mercury 6 thought I was going to be a rubber stamp boss, they were in for a surprise.
They thought with Deke that he would simply be the Wisconsin farm boy that would come in and sort of a figurehead. But they didn't know what a manager and what type of a person Deke Slayton was, what a doer he was. He wound up selecting the crews.
I didn't want the job I had, but I was going to do it the best way I could. And sure enough, I got tested right off the bat. Gordo Cooper was going to wrap up the Mercury program with our most daring flight yet, 36 hours in space. It was 4 times longer than we'd ever flown, and a lot longer than the Mercury spacecraft was originally meant to fly. So Gordo had a little fun with the name. He called it Faith 7. NASA wasn't amused. Gordo had a habit of stepping on NASA's toes. Nobody questioned his ability, just his judgment. Typical Gordo. 2 days before his flight, he came roaring in low over the launch complex, practically scared the pants off the flight director, Walt Williams.
He showed unusually bad judgment in that he flew at a low altitude close to the administration building. So low, in fact, that when Walt Williams looked out the window, here's this jet streaking by below his altitude.
I lit the afterburner right over the top of the hangar.
Yeah. And he went back to headquarters, he called me up and he said, "Shepard, is your suit ready?" And I said, "What do you mean? Of course my suit's ready." He says, "Well, I'm pulling Gordo off the flight, you're going."
Walt was dead serious about replacing Cooper with Shepard. And he'd have done it too, except it wasn't his job anymore, it was mine. And even though he got carried away, I knew pulling Gordo off that flight would kill his astronaut career. I wasn't going to do that.
Roger, have a lift off and the clock is operating. Sigma 7, phase 7 on the way.
Gordo's flight went perfect for the first 30 hours. Then all of a sudden, the man in the can had some real work to do.
Wonder if you'd relay to the Cape little situation I had happen, see what they think on it.
System by system, the spacecraft started dying. Autopilot dead, attitude readings dead, electrical systems all dead.
Well, things are beginning to stack up a little. ASCS inverter is acting up. And my CO2 is building up in the suit. And my inverter won't come on the line. And other than that, things are fine.
About the only thing still working up there was Gordo. But he was about to attempt a completely manual re-entry, something no one had ever done before.
I'm looking for lots of experience on this flight. He's gonna get it.
He'd only get one chance. If he was off, he'd burn alive. Everything that should have been automatic, he had to do himself. All he had was a wristwatch on his arm for timing, eyeballs on the horizon for alignment, and finger on the button to fire his retro rockets. And he did it perfect. Right on the old bazoo, the Oklahoma hot dog landed closer to the carrier than anyone else. Gordo's performance was the ultimate proof of how well a man can fly a spacecraft. Why you needed men there in the first place.
One of the things which warmed us the most during this flight was the realization that however extraordinary computers may be, that we are still ahead of them, and that man is still the most extraordinary computer of all.
Project Mercury ended on a great note, and John Kennedy seemed to be as pleased as we were. He came down to the Cape to have a look at the huge new Saturn booster they were building for the moonshots, his baby. It was November 18th, 1963.
Kennedy put his hands in his coat pocket and leaned back on the heels and looked up to that huge first stage of Saturn. And I could just see in his eyes that he just loved the whole thing. This was romance. This was out there with Alexander the Great and Napoleon.
The conquest of space must and will go ahead. That much we know. That much we can say with confidence.
He gave a speech, and it was the story of these two boys and how they would go across the Irish countryside, and when they ran into a fence or an obstacle.
And when they came to an orchard wall that seemed too high and too doubtful to try,
one of the boys would grab the other's hat and throw it over the wall, and then they would have to climb the wall to retrieve the cap. Kennedy's analogy was, we have thrown our cap over the wall. We're going for it.
This nation has tossed its cap over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it.
And then the next day, of course, he was dead, killed.
There has been a shooting. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. A priest has been ordered. Emergency supplies of blood also being rushed to the hospital. The President of the United States is dead.
Terrible news. But I got to tell you, after the shock, my first thought was, what will this do to the program? I knew we'd lost a big fan.
It was my feeling that he was really a space cadet because he was excited about what men had done and could do in space.
We were his favorites. We were part of his little group, and all of us felt very comfortable with the President of the United States, like he was a buddy.
We must assure our preeminence in the peaceful exploration of outer space, focusing on an expedition to the moon in this decade.
Lyndon Johnson. If there was a bigger fan of space than Kennedy, it had to be old Lyndon. But now with Kennedy gone, meeting his deadline meant more than ever. We felt like we owed it to him. The program was really gearing up. Now, with Mercury over, we entered the next phase, Project Gemini.
Mr. Neil A. Armstrong, Air Force Major Frank Borman.
The Gemini 9, rookies here to make their mark. The Mercury guys welcomed them with all the warmth of a pit bull on a short leash.
It was more than competitive. It was psychological. It was, well, we're anointed, you're not, you got to pay your dues. I mean, these weren't expressed, and it wasn't written in any order. I have never seen a group of people stiff-arm another group like that.
The 9 looked up to the 7 as more or less their mentors, and probably the 7 said, hey, we can handle all this ourselves. Why do we need these 9 guys?
The fact was, we did need these new guys. The new Gemini program had to test and prove every technique we would need to reach the moon.
Project Gemini, a step which will
Could we maneuver spacecraft with precision? Could we rendezvous and dock 2 ships together? Could our bodies and our minds survive 14 days of weightlessness, the length of time a trip to the moon would take? And could we leave the safety of the spacecraft to walk and work in space? If we failed any one of these, we weren't going to the moon. 2 test pilots in a Gemini capsule was going to be a tight fit. We could really have used an extra room just for their egos.
When we started flying spacecraft with more than 1 person in it, obviously we had to have titles for the people. The natural title would be pilot and co-pilot. No one in the astronaut corps wanted to be called a co-pilot, so scratching their heads, management came up with commander and pilot.
There was no debate about who would command the first Gemini mission. It was Al Shepard all the way, America's first man in space. I wouldn't have it any other way. God knows neither would Al.
We had been training, I guess, perhaps a couple of months, and got up one morning, walking to the bathroom, and all of a sudden I totally lost my balance. It was almost as if I was spinning. Of course I wasn't, but I steadied myself and thought, well, gosh, I didn't really drink that much last night.
An inner ear problem, Meniere's disease. It knocked Al flat on his butt and right off flight status. Dizzy spells, disorientation. He wasn't flying anywhere.
Well, after the initial shock wore off, the initial shock, of course, was total disbelief that they could ground the best pilot they ever had. I told him I'd been flying fighter planes and I'd been a test pilot all of my life, and I'd fire the damn thing upside down, right side up, didn't make any difference to me.
He was grounded. I knew if Al couldn't fly, he'd go nuts being on the sidelines. So I asked him to join me running the astronaut office until he could get the medics off his back. Al and I were both out. The original 7 were down to 5, and then we lost another.
Is there a possibility that you would go back to the space agency?
There was a rumor going around that NASA was nervous about risking John Glenn's life on another flight. He was a lot more useful as a living hero than as a dead martyr. So they offered him a desk job.
For me to stick around being the world's oldest permanent training used second-hand astronaut, whatever, I didn't want to really do that.
The man who hurtled to fame as the first American to orbit the Earth tosses his space helmet into the ring as a political candidate. Lieutenant Colonel...
Now Gus Grissom would fly the first Gemini. Gus took John Young with him, the first of the rookies to fly in space. Gemini was a sports car compared to Mercury.
Roger pitch. You're on your way, Molly Brown.
Everything worked great. The Gemini program was off to a beautiful start. And then the Russians walked.
At 8:30 Greenwich Mean Time, the second pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Leonov, left the spaceship. He was wearing a special spacesuit.
They were first in space, first to orbit, first woman in space, and all of a sudden here's another first for the Russian program.
Every time we stepped forward, it seemed like they were taking 2 steps.
Even in our most ambitious plans, we hadn't thought of sending a man outside for months. Now, that would have to change. The Russian spacewalk was their most impressive first since Sputnik. We had to respond on our next flight, Gemini 4, months ahead of schedule. We did.
My feet are out.
Space is the enemy of life. No air, full of radiation. In shade, you'd freeze to death. In direct sun, you'd burn up. For years, everything we did was designed to protect us from it. Now we were opening the hatch, and Ed White was putting his head right in the Dragon's mouth.
I'm under my own control.
We held our breath.
Okay.
So far, so good.
Okay, I'm coming over. It looks beautiful. I feel like $1 million. This is the greatest experience I've just remembered.
I think that once you get out and float, thinking that you're a couple hundred miles up in space and there's nothing below you except way below, and it's sort of a tranquil or lethargic experience that you sort of want to, just enjoy it.
Right now, I'm standing on my head. I'm looking right down. It looks like we're coming up on the coast of California.
Ed White's spacewalk was a triumph. Everyone was dazzled, and it seemed so easy. Scratch one obstacle on the way to the moon. 6 months later, Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford tackled the next Gemini goal, rendezvous with another vehicle. They were going to meet up with Gemini 7, flown by Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. It would test a critical step on the way to the moon. This was the kind of mission Wally loved. Pure precision flying with almost no science experiments.
You're cleared for takeoff. Roger, adios. Minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition.
Ignition. But no liftoff. It just sat there, and we waited for it to blow. Wally and Tom were left sitting on a ticking bomb, a mountain of high explosive fuel, just waiting for a spark.
Perfect countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Clock started, no liftoff. It was much more traumatic than that, of course. What had happened, the engines came up to speed, and it stopped. And but logic, this is all millisecond logic, said, hey, we haven't lifted off. If we had lifted off and it started to shut down, our recourse was to eject out of there, and I would pull this ring between my legs and it would eject both of us out from the spacecraft.
The statistics were that 75% of ejections were successful, and the definition of successful was that the guy didn't get killed.
Wally ignored the rules and followed his instinct. He didn't pull the escape ring. It was a gutsy move.
Full tanks are venting.
Okay, no problem on these tanks?
Negative.
Okay, we're just sitting here breathing.
Instinct. Man over machine. If that ejection system had been automatic, they'd have been blasted out of the spacecraft, wrecking it, the mission, and their bodies. Instead, 3 days later, Wally and Tom were back on their way, headed for Gemini 7. We were about to find out if our moon plan had a chance. It all depended on 2 vehicles meeting up in the vastness of space. If we couldn't rendezvous, we'd have to rethink our whole approach. They had to find each other, close in, and hold formation, all at over 17,000 miles an hour.
7 and 6, would you continue with the description of your station keeping?
Wally and Tom met up with Frank and Jim as if they'd done it 100 times before.
Right now, 6 is about 10 feet above and to the left of 7. We're just flying nose to nose, approximately 16 feet apart.
Yeah, we're sitting up here playing bridge together. We're in formation with 7.
Excellent.
Precision flying at over 17,000 miles an hour. It was a long way from monkeys on automatic pilot. This was what we'd signed up for. Gemini 6 went home, leaving Frank Borman and Jim Lovell to take a crack at the next Gemini goal, duration. Could their bodies last a full 14 days in space, the length of a round-trip flight to the moon? The doctors worried about their bodies. I worried about their sanity. 2 test pilot egos locked for 2 weeks in a space the size of a phone booth.
Well, nobody ever really slept because the activity of the other person would continually wake up the person that was trying to sleep.
It was the beginning of a beautiful relationship.
14 days in a Gemini spacecraft is a very, very trying experience.
Being 14 days with Frank Borman any place was wild, so.
I think Jim Lovell brought Mark Twain's Roughing It, which was apropos. But I don't believe we read it much.
There was a song that was sung by Nat King Cole. And I'm trying to think of what the name of it was.
We sang it for 14 days. It's Put Your Sweet Lips a Little Closer to the Phone, Nat King Cole.
Put your sweet lips a little closer to the phone.
Put your sweet lips a little closer to the phone. Let's pretend that we're together all alone.
That went on for 2 weeks. And of course, Borman and I were alone.
See, I'd forgotten all about that. You're exactly right.
Frank and Jim were guinea pigs. The doctors were taking bets on what would happen when they landed. Odds were they'd be in pretty bad shape. Some thought they might not survive.
I remember when we were back on Earth, I looked at Lovell, and Lovell looked at me, and we said, well, I said, you going to pass out? And he said, no, and we were fine.
Yeah, well, we held hands and said we want to tell the world that we're engaged. I actually had to command my legs, left, right, as I walked across the carrier deck. My wife took a look at the movies, and she said it looked to me like I had my pants full, as I was leaned over and just, trudging along like a little boy would do with his pants full.
So much for medical fears. Now we knew man wouldn't be the weak link going to the moon. Gemini was on a roll, cracking a new problem every 3 months. Next up was docking, physically joining 2 spacecraft together.
Hello, Houston. This is Gemini 8. We're station keeping on the Agena at about 150 feet.
Gemini 8 would dock with an unmanned Agena booster.
Boy, look at that sucker. Man, that's great. Man, that is really slick.
Commander was a young civilian named Neil Armstrong. He'd had a pilot's license since he was 16, flew fighters in Korea, and tested X-15s at Edwards.
Okay, Gemini 8, we have TM solid. You're looking good on the ground. Go ahead and dock. Flight, we are down. Oh, roger. Hey, congratulations. This is real good.
Then, without warning, they started spinning out of control. They were going faster than the whirligig at the county fair. Neil undocked and pulled back. But that only made it worse. Much worse.
Well, we got serious problems here with we're coupling end over end, but we're disengaged from the Agena.
A thruster was stuck. They were doing a somersault every second and getting faster all the time. At this rate, they'd pass out. And that'd be all she wrote. As a last resort, Neil fired his re-entry thrusters. It worked. Now they had to get down immediately. 5,000 miles off course and in the wrong ocean, but they were safe. Spacewalking, rendezvous, long duration, docking. We'd tried out everything we'd need to reach the moon, and we still had 4 Gemini missions left. The moon was looking closer all the time.
Astronauts Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan are suited up, ready to go.
We would use the last Gemini flights to practice the one minor detail left, working in space. Ed White had made it look easy, but all he did was float around. Now Gene Cernan would try a few simple jobs. Open valves, tighten fittings. just to prove when we got to the moon we could work there.
There's even time for a joke with a giant match, an obvious sign of a relaxed, confident pre-flight mood.
We were all sure it would be easy. We were all dead wrong.
Tom Stafford reports that Cernan is encountering some fogging up of the visor. They are keeping the...
When I would turn a valve, if I wasn't held in my position in some way or another, I'd turn the valve, and the valve was a little tough to turn. It would turn me back, and my body would float away, and you'd start tumbling, and you start rolling.
In zero gravity, Gene was having a wrestling match with himself. He was using all of his energy just to try to stay still. Never mind do any work.
Okay, he's fogging real bad. Perhaps he's hardcore to keep the foggy down to the minimum.
I lost 13 pounds. That's an awful lot of weight. I ended up with 100% humidity in my suit, and my entire visor got completely fogged over.
To do with the turnaround, presented far more difficulty to let go in zero G than they could.
Gene was totally blinded by the visor. He was physically exhausted, near collapse, and getting back in that spacecraft was something no one else could do for him.
They said if something happened and the fella was hung up outside, that we were to not do anything rash, but we would have to eventually release him and close the hatch and bring the vehicle back.
There's no way Tom could have re-entered successfully had he been towing me behind him. First of all, I would have burned up and been killed during re-entry, so what's the use of going through that? Second of all, he probably would have burned up himself. He would not have been able to close the hatch, and so instead of losing one manual, we would have lost two.
Blinded, almost passing out, Gino finally made it back inside. We were starting to realize there was a lot about working in space we just didn't understand.
Now, let's just sit down and take a rest.
When Dick Gordon tried it on Gemini 11, he just about lost it too.
How you doing? Tired, Pete. All right, just rest.
Working in space was looking like the showstopper. We had guys exhausting themselves almost into unconsciousness. If we couldn't get out and work, going to the moon would be nothing but a sightseeing trip. Obviously, we needed to rethink the problem. It was time for a new angle, a different take, a different kind of guy. A really different kind of guy.
I think I understood the importance of being gentle and delicate and in control of the momentum or the mass of the body during spacewalks. I think I understood that just intuitively. These things were natural to me. They obviously were not natural to the Navy people who were trying to do spacewalking. So their overconfident attitude got them into trouble.
Buzz was a mechanical genius. His IQ must be sky high.
He was the first PhD pilot in the program. PhDs always kind of had a certain shock value particularly among the Slaytons and the Shepherds who knew they were a hell of a lot smarter than all the PhDs in the world.
Buzz was our MIT scientist pilot. He was smart, he was inventive, and some thought he was arrogant as hell. He got tagged from the day he arrived.
Gus Grissom and I were part of an interview team for a new group of astronauts, and Buzz Aldrin came in to our interview just for Gus and me. And sport coat, shirt and tie, and around his tie is this little chain thing. Hanging from the chain are Air Force wings. Below it, a Phi Beta Kappa gate. Gus looks up and said, "Aldrin, we've already read your resume. Why the hell are you wearing it?"
Buzz was absolutely certain he could do it better, way better. He threw out the pulley system we'd been using for training. Then he threw a space capsule in a swimming pool and went in after it. Right before our eyes, he invented the art of working in space. Buzz got together tools like he was fixing to climb Mount Everest. Footholds, handholds, Velcro grips, bungee cords. By the time he was ready to go, he looked like Mr. Goodwrench.
Now the electrical connector. With no waste tethers.
Buzz was like a human fly, working out there for hours and having a ball. He made it look easy. For him, it was.
Gemini 12, Houston Capcom, 1 minute to LOS. New EVA record, beautiful job.
Say what you want about Buzz Aldrin, but be sure to add the word successful. He succeeded where everyone else failed and put us back on track toward the moon. The Gemini program was an unqualified success. It was on to Apollo.
In Mercury and Gemini, a total of 26 astronauts have logged a total of 1,900 hours in space, covering 35 million miles.
Gemini has demonstrated the feasibility of almost everything we plan to do in Apollo.
Gentlemen, the Gemini program is now officially completed.
In the 5.5 years since Al Shepard's flight, we'd come a long way. We hadn't heard from the Russians in a while. For all we knew, we were ahead. We'd learned a few lessons the hard way, paid some dues. The moon now seemed so close we felt like we could touch it. But we'd soon find out, on our first attempt, we'd almost push it away forever.